I'm a hair mineral analysis expert. I have a background in functional medicine, and I educate people using HTMA testing to maximize health, erase debilitating symptoms, and gain energy. I'm a multi-time kettlebell sport world champion, and I'm constantly searching for high-performance pros from all over the world to bring you this human optimization podcast. My name is Lisa Pitel-Killah. Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Human Optimization Podcast, now brought to you by Vicon Supplements. Haven't heard about Vicon yet? They have a performance, foundational, and custom powder line based on your own bio-individuality. If you haven't checked them out yet, visit https://viconsups.com. So today on the show, I have Dr. Aaron Gonshor. He is a PhD physiologist and a maxillofacial surgeon. He has published and lectured extensively on implant therapy and the use of stem cell technology in tissue grafting. For over 14 years, he headed the clinical advisory and educational boards of both surgical and surgical science systems providers of surgical equipment and expertise in the fast-growing area of salivary diagnostics, which led him to create Fluids IQ. And now he lectures extensively on the biological foundations of intestinal permeability and the salivary hormone analysis. And a big welcome to Dr. Aaron Gonshor. You've already heard all about his bio, and now he's going to tell us a little bit more about himself, as well as what led him to create Fluids IQ.
Well, hello, Lisa, and to your audience, thank you very much for having me. I'm really very, very excited about spending time with you. My story is an interesting one, I think. I started off as a PhD physiologist, as a scientist, and moved from there into a professional career where I entered into maxillofacial surgery. I actually spent quite a few decades doing reconstruction of jaws and faces and taking bones from hips and doing all kinds of other damage, and never left my love of research, which had to do with the oral area. I became specialized in the area of saliva in terms of a lot of research we were doing. And so a good number of years ago, decided that I'd like to really go back to my first love, which was research in physiology, and opened up a lab which specialized in saliva. And we did that in Toronto, and it is an ISO accredited laboratory. ISO is an international standard that is very difficult to get, and most labs in the world, if they want to be part of the upper level club where other labs will talk to them and so on, they need to attain what's called ISO 15189, which we did get a good number of years ago. For those who are from the United States, that's sort of equivalent to what's called CLIA. And so these are high standard labs. And our area of expertise was saliva. And we chose hormones to be treated with the medium of saliva, as far as laboratory work was concerned. And so that's what we started to do. And so we were doing adrenal hormone checking. We can go into that in a few minutes, and sex hormones, etc., because saliva is known as really one of the gold standards for looking at hormone levels and so on in the body, which we can go into in more detail. And we have continued to do that, but it didn't take very long before, by some stroke of luck, we happened to find out that we had the good fortune to be able to start looking at a peptide called Zonulin, which again we'll discuss in a few minutes. And that led us to opening up a series of tests, which we call our Intestinal IQ series. And that is looking at biomarkers for intestinal function. And we used as the platform for that blood spot. which many of the people listening would know, that if you have little babies, little preemies, and you want to be able to take blood, you take it from their toes or their feet, and you actually have them drop some blood onto a card.
Yeah.
The nurses do. Or diabetics will quite often take some blood from their fingertips and place it onto a card. So they have a blood spot.
Yeah.
And when that dries, it's called a dry blood spot. And that is what you send to the lab. So that really allowed people to be able to do testing, just like with saliva, in the comfort of their homes, and then to send it out to the lab. And in the lab, we would do whatever labs do, the magic they create to be able to then do whatever they need to do. So we did, our second group was intestinal IQ, blood spot testing for, there it is.
Just for those of you watching on YouTube, because this is actually on my list for today, as well as what the other tests that we're going to talk about too, because I'm doing them all.
And I'm just going to tell you that the last thing that we did just a little while ago, it's actually last month, we introduced our first series of tests using dried urine. The same way that you do dried blood spot, you can now do dried urine, which is even easier because you don't have to poke your finger. You literally have to have some urine in a glass, and to put the card, looks very much like the dried blood spot card, and you just get the urine to saturate the card, let it dry, and again, comfort of your home, and you send it out to the lab. And that we call our metabolic IQ. It's metabolic wellness profile. Yes, and it comes in an envelope. Exactly. It's really easy, very easy. And we'll go over, I don't want to steal our thunder for the next few minutes, but that is really dealing with metabolic function, which is another key thing that we need to do. And I need to state right in the beginning that right from the get-go, our lab designated itself as a lab that does wellness testing. These are non-diagnostic tests.
Yes.
They're extremely important. They're screening tests. They give you tremendous amounts of information, but they're not diagnostic. That means that both the healthcare professional and the patient or client need to understand that the healthcare professional that's dealing with them is not doing what a physician would do, which is to do diagnostic tests. None of these tests tell you, oh, you have celiac disease, or oh, you have Addison's disease, etc. No such thing. It will give you a roadmap and help you understand more of what you need to do to eventually get at that answer, which will include other healthcare professionals, including physicians, etc. But these are wellness, non-diagnostic screening tests.
Yes. Yeah. And again, as you stated, very important. And so I want to dive into gut health. And, you know, it's been said many, many times that our gut is our second brain. And without our gut functioning well and absorbing well and getting our nutrients into our system, then we're not going to be well. And so let's get into that. And then we'll talk about how zonulin plays a big part in that.
Well, it's only been recently, during the time of Socrates, during the Greek time, that said that the gut is the foundation of all our health. They didn't quite understand all the ways, but clearly they understood how important the gut is.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take much to really understand why that's true. I mean, the gut is, in fact, that tube that starts in the mouth and ends in the other end, is really, if you think about it, an external tube that sits in our body.
Yeah.
And we're pushing stuff down that tube constantly, liquids and various solids, etc. And the body has to figure out a way that it is going to be able to take whatever is coming in there, if it's nutrients, whatever it is, and make sense of it, take what it needs, not allow what it doesn't need to go into places that it shouldn't be, and at the same time, to be able to signal to the rest of the body that everything is fine, or if it's not fine, what do we need to do to stop the trouble before it gets worse?
Right.
And that's asking a tremendous amount of what is in fact our gastrointestinal system. And it is a beauty to behold, the way in which it is able to function. On top of which, it is the home of somewhere in the area of about 150 trillion bacteria. And so when you think about it, bacteria make up, and it's called the microbiome. For those who are listening, you know that that's now something everybody hears about. Like, what is this thing, this microbiome? And in fact, it is a wonder. It is all of these bacteria in their myriad colonies living within the gastrointestinal system that are not only there to help us digest, to help us keep immune balance, to keep us healthy, but in fact, they are absolutely necessary to our being alive. Very clearly, if you don't have bacteria in the gut, you're dead.
Yeah.
You can't stay alive because they are absolutely essential to breaking down many of the nutrients which we have to have in order to be able to live. And so thanks to the bacteria, we're able to do that. And so that's also in this tube that is sitting in our body. So yes, the gut is absolutely essential to the health of our body, and we need to understand how it works. And the good news is that in the last several years, hasn't been that long, we've begun to get a much better idea and are solidifying our understanding of what the gut does for the rest of the body. But make no mistake, we're only at the beginning. We're making baby steps in understanding how it works. And what we're seeing is absolutely astounding. And so we can get into that.
Yes. And so zonulin, right? Peptide. And more, I watched a video with you. I was doing my research, and I can't wait to watch a couple of more, because you got into autoimmune, which we're going to get into a little bit today as well. And it was astonishing, the reestablishment, the modulation, we're going to get into that. And just with the effects that produced and brought to the table and what you've discovered. And so let's share zonulin and how that all fits into that picture.
Well, before you can discuss zonulin, what you really need to understand is how we now understand that the gut actually works. More specifically, what is the function of this one cell thick, just one cell barrier, which represents the intestinal barrier of cells that do all these wonderful things. And this one cell barrier used to be considered like a mortar and cement in a home. You had bricks, you had cement between the bricks, and that's what closed off the area. And somehow the cells managed to get stuff, nutrients through those cells, and it went to the other side. And that's the way you created the energy that you needed, etc. Well, that's not the way it works. In fact, going back about 50 years ago, there were a good number of studies that came out that said, you know what, it's not mortar and brick. In fact, it's just the opposite. That what we do have is a very dynamic system. Not only does the cell do its own thing and transports little nutrient pieces through it, but between the cells, which used to be the mortar between the brick, in fact, it's anything but mortar. Right. It, in fact, is a series of doors that open and close, and those doors allow various types of nutrients and other things to enter, and things that the body can get rid of, that it can push into the gut if it doesn't need them anymore, or it says, I don't want you in my body, I want you out into the gut so you can eliminate it. Well, something has to be there. There has to be some door that allows stuff to get through from one side to the other. And in fact, it exists. It's now very well known, and it is called the tight junctions. The tight junctions, in fact, are made up of this really wonderful series, a net, a conjunction of proteins that really are interconnected. And there is occludin and claudin and Zoe 1, 2, and 3, and it goes on and on and on. And we're now beginning to understand that this conglomeration of proteinaceous substances is sitting and is like a junction between the cells. Mm-hmm. And something controls them. It is able to tell them when they should decouple or allow an opening and when they can come back together again to close the door. Because of course you got to close the door again. You don't want it to be open all the time. That causes its own problems. And so what was discovered about 20 years ago was that there are a series of peptides, small proteins, if we can call it, that are the controllers of this. And the best known of these is zonulin. It was discovered by Alessio Fasano and his team in Maryland. Alessio, who's become someone that I consider a friend, he and his team were able to discover, for reasons which we can get into if we have a lot of time, that zonulin in fact exists, and that the intestinal cells, that one cell barrier, has receptors that are able to glomp on to various types of bacteria or food, and that stimulates the cell to produce zonulin. Mm-hmm. And zonulin, in a bit of a circuitous path, eventually ends up saying to those tight junctions, open. And when it does that, they open, and they open for a few seconds. They can open for a few minutes in some cases, which is a long period of time. Mm-hmm. And then when it stops stimulating them, they close again. And so zonulin, which in humans is actually a pre-haptoglobin 2, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's in fact synonymous with zonulin that is seen in various other animals and so on. So it is a well-known entity, and it is the first objective biomarker that we have found that we know controls this space between the cells, this critical opening. And that, in fact, not only opened up the trapdoor, but opened up our minds to really understanding that the gut is a very dynamic system that is able to push stuff back and forth between the rest of the body and the gut. And that opened not only research into how that functions, but gave us a much more fundamental understanding of how the gut affects the rest of the body. And you mentioned autoimmune disease. There are many other things which we can go into. So zonulin, to be clear, and another small group of peptides related to it, we call them the zonulin family of peptides, are the controllers of not only the cells of the gut, but we've now found zonulin and these other little peptides in cells all over the body, including the heart and the lungs and the kidneys and the blood-brain barrier. And I don't think it takes much to say, wait a minute, does that mean now that we have a way of understanding how the body can control what gets into the area of the brain and what it manages to keep out? And the answer is, yeah, that's exactly what's going on. Wow. So it's opening up very exciting pathways for research.
That's incredible. And what a discovery, right? A new breakthrough with regards to how that all affects the body in many different areas, right? And
absolutely.
So let's go back just a little bit, because we do have, I want to kind of touch on this, because you had talked about the discovery and just of zonulin and how that came about. Share a little bit on that, because I'm curious.
Well, it's fascinating because some of the original research that was done by Alessio Fasano and his large group was on a disease which many of your listeners will know very well, and it's called cholera.
Mm-hmm.
And cholera is a disease that still is killing hundreds of thousands of people each year, tragically, many of them children. And cholera, for those who know anything about it, is caused by a bacterium, which it's called cholerae, bacterial cholerae. And this bacterium does something very insidious. What it does is that it stimulates the cell of the intestine to produce zonulin. And what it does and that's its way of being able to get into the body, the cholera bacteria gets in, it is stimulating the body then to produce zonulin. And when it opens, when those doors open, remember the tight junctions, what happens is that liquid begins to leave the body because the body is fighting with all its might to get rid of the bacteria and toxin, because cholera produces a toxin that actually stimulates the production of zonulin. And so the body says, can't have that. I got to get rid of it. And it starts pushing liquid out through the body into the gut because those tight junctions are open. And the liquid doesn't stop leaving the body. And that's why cholera, for those who know about it, people die because of dehydration. They are vomiting and they have diarrhea that doesn't stop. Diarrhea is literally that liquid coming out of the body through the tight junctions and never stops because the toxin keeps that door open. And remember, it normally opens and closes. But if it stays open all the time, then you've got a problem. So just by luck, Fasano and his group said, wait a second, what is this toxin? And it was, in fact, the zonula toxin. And they called the peptide zonulin. And that's why we have the word zonulin. It is not because of any other reason than they wanted to give it that name. Given the light bulb moment was to say, well, wait a second. If the bacterium is doing that with a toxin, there is this entity sitting in our body that can be stimulated to open up tight junctions. Does the body have its own internal ability to do that? It must, because why would the tight junctions be there? And so they discovered on chromosome 16 of our bodies that, in fact, there are genes that produce a pre-haptoglobin 2 molecule, which is identical to the zonulin molecules seen in other mammals. And it turns out that that is what we have in our human bodies. That is the molecule which we are calling zonulin. And there are a couple of other molecules which are very close to it, which do the same thing. And so the body now, they were able to discover, and that was the aha moment when they said, so that's what's going on. And receptors on the intestinal cells are able to interact with the gut in such a way that they know when zonulin needs to be produced, when the tight junctions need to open, when it needs to close again, etc. And suddenly we understood the fundamental dynamic aspect of the gut. And of course, that opened up the floodgates, so to speak, to our thinking about how the gut actually functions.
Yes. And so I do want to get into autoimmune because we're kind of moving right into that path. And when we're talking about tight junctions, the first step that a lot of people, especially children now, are dealing with are food sensitivities. And I think you made a very valid point when I was doing my research, was that food sensitivities, people kind of group them all into one area, right, in one group. And that's not really the case, because there's different small little pockets of food sensitivities and what they actually mean, right? We've got food allergies, we've got sensitivities. And so let's talk a little bit about food sensitivities, and then I want to move into autoimmune and that modulation.
Well, I think the first thing you need to remember is that there's a difference between the term sensitivity and allergy.
Yeah.
And quite often those are used interchangeably. They shouldn't be. We have many different types of immunoglobulins. Those are other proteins which our immune system, which cells in our immune system, the defenders of the body, will send out as both signaling messengers and actually to act as guards, as part of an army of guards that we have in the gut, we have it in all other parts of the body. And one can break those up into four major groups. And I'm not going to get into the weeds, but
yeah.
I will tell you that we have immunoglobulin G, M, like mother, and A. And those are the immunoglobulins which you can bring together under the word of sensitivity. They are the immunoglobulins which, when they do what they do, and we can get into that in a moment, will signal to the body that there is something that the body needs to deal with to either neutralize, get rid of, or whatever.
Yeah.
However, those are not very high spiking reactions to the extent that they will be incredibly detrimental to the body within seconds or minutes. That is done by one other immunoglobulin group, and that is IgE. And IgE creates what we classically call allergic response. An allergic response is the body saying, oh my, there is something very critical going on here, which I can't allow. And I'm going to send out the big army very quickly to try to deal with this. And that can cause extremely strong reactions in the body. The end point of that being what some of your listeners will remember as anaphylactic shock, which literally is such a strong reaction of the body that it will close down the body's functioning. That's how strong the reaction actually is. That's allergic response. We are not dealing with that when we are dealing with what most foods will produce. And I don't want to throw a screw in the work and tell you, yes, some foods in some people at some moments can actually trigger an allergic response.
Yeah.
That is true. And so some people need to have EpiPens and other things with them because they know that if they take in certain types of food, it'll get out of the sensitivity range and IgE is going to take over, and that's bad.
Yeah.
And then they've got an allergic response. So the vast majority of responses to foods are sensitivity responses. And one needs to understand that most of the way in which sensitivity responses occur is right within the gut itself. The gut is actually a very, as I said, a very dynamic area. And we now know it's not just a tube that has a bunch of bacteria lying around, but in fact is a very complex system that has on the surfaces where those cells are, there's a big covering of mucus. And in fact, the mucus isn't just one layer, it's two layers. It's a layer that, and each layer has its own city of bacteria and all kinds of other colonies that are set up in a very hierarchical system. And every group of bacteria and so on know exactly what they need to do. They know where they need to be. They are not just allowed to move wherever they want. They have to stay within a certain area. And the body is constantly monitoring that by sending little pods through the cells and between cells that are checking out what is going on. These are called dendritic cells, and they actually are checking to see, is there some food in here that shouldn't be here? Are there any toxins here that we need to neutralize? And if yes, it calls in the troops. Right. And those troops are part of what's called secretory IgA. Remember I mentioned immunoglobulin A? Mm-hmm. There is a subset of that grouping that is taking place in the gut, in saliva, and so on. And it's called secretory IgA. And these immunoglobulins literally live in that mucus. And their job is to sit around looking for stuff that shouldn't be there. And if it shouldn't be there, it glomps onto it. Mm. And it says, gotcha. And as soon as it does that, it says to cells that are sitting there, I am now complexed with this piece of food, this bacterium, this complex of an antibody and an antigen. And an antigen is whatever this food particle or bacteria is. And now it gets complexed. And the body says, great, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for those complexes. As soon as I've got them, I will neutralize them. And it tries to do that within the gut. It says, you are not coming into the rest of the body. We now have caught you, mm-hmm. and we're going to get rid of you. But in order for any of that to happen, you need to have that mucus city. That city needs to be filled with mucus. If there is no mucus, then all of it dies away. It can't function. And so what we're talking about with food sensitivity is, what is the ability of the body to be able to see all of this food coming in? How does it decide what is good, what is bad, what it needs to get rid of immediately, mm-hmm. what it needs to break down, in which way does it break them down, and so on. And so what we really look at when we're looking at food sensitivities is several things. Number one, we're looking at the different food groups, right? Classically, mm-hmm. we have 5 food groups. Some call them 7. Let's forget whether it's 5 or 7. Let's call it 5. And these different food groups are dealt with in different parts of the gastrointestinal system. And so in the stomach, you got to break them down. You've got an acidic environment. You start breaking down mostly proteins. And then in the intestine, you're breaking down mostly the carbohydrates and the fats. And that continues down to the end of one portion of the intestine, etc. So what you really want to know when you're doing food sensitivity testing, what you really want to know is, how well are the body's enzymes functioning? Because many of the food sensitivities that we think we have are because the body is not properly breaking down those foods. So if you're not breaking down proteins well enough, then what you need to say to yourself is, well, where are proteins normally broken down? Most of them are broken down in the stomach. Oh, maybe I've got a problem with an imbalance of my proteinaceous enzymes. Well, I'm not breaking down carbohydrates well. I have a problem with grain breakdown. The grains. Well, what breaks down grains? Well, mostly enzymes that are coming from the pancreas. Well, wait a second, then maybe I should be looking at that plethora, that grouping of enzymes that emanate from the pancreas. And it's the same with fats. If that's happening, what are the enzymes? Well, the enzymes that come from bile, right? Yeah. Including bile itself, the bile acids. So if we're having a problem with fats, which you're seeing because the food sensitivities that we're doing on these tests seems to be going up, well, quite often it's because you're not breaking down the fats properly. Well, why am I not breaking them down? Because you have a deficiency, an imbalance of the various enzymes, etc., coming from bile. So when you're doing testing for food sensitivity, the key is not, oh, look at this, there's one food here that's high. Yeah, that may be interesting. What's really interesting, though, are there certain food groups that are showing high? Because that tells you where is the major enzymatic imbalance. And that is key to understanding where food sensitivity and its testing sits within the whole realm. And I should answer one other thing before you ask the question. Well, what if someone says, well, I did food sensitivity testing and I don't understand it. They checked me out. I had some problems with some foods. I took them out of my diet and I still don't feel well. Something's wrong. Yeah, well, what's wrong is that it wasn't just your foods. It was many other things that were causing a problem. And it's not all about the food itself. It's about much more, which of course we can discuss.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think people try and blame it on foods and then they do, and I've never been a big fan of going to the first level. It's what's the root cause? Let's keep digging, right? Let's keep digging down that hole until we actually get to the bottom so that we can fix everything above. And I think that's where sometimes that the testing, especially when people are looking at it without the help maybe of a practitioner, that they're really not kind of digging deeper into what you've already evaluated on, which is very valuable information. And so now,
absolutely.
Let's talk about leaky gut syndrome or increased intestinal permeability. We've talked about tight junctions, how they work. And so what happens when now we start to see leaky gut? Because that now can lead us down the road of other more serious, kind of disease, if you may, celiac, irritable bowel syndrome, things like that. Let's talk about that.
Well, remember, in order to understand the importance of what leaky gut is, and as you said, it's really leaky gut is a term we use for the intestinal permeability increasing, those tight junctions opening more often for longer periods, etc. Mm-hmm. And the question then becomes, well, what happens when it opens up? Well, what happens when it opens up is stuff gets into the body that should never have allowed to get into the body.
Exactly.
And what is that? Well, there are two major things. One of them is macromolecules. In other words, pieces of food that are very large that should never have gotten in. They needed to be broken down much more before they got in. But whoops, they managed to get through that trap door. And now they're sitting on the other side of the cell where they shouldn't be.
Right.
And the other thing that gets in are bacteria that shouldn't be in there. And if you have pathogenic bacteria in much greater numbers in the gut, then those bacteria have on their membranes something called LPS. Those are lipopolysaccharides, which I'm not going to go into in great detail. But here's the interesting thing. When a bacterium is broken down, it sheds that membrane. And when the membrane breaks down, those lipopolysaccharides become free, and they act as toxins, and they actually get in through those tight junction trap doors. Now, what happens when they get to the other side? Well, the other thing you need to remember is that the body considers the intestine so critical to its proper balance and hemostasis or normal functioning of the body that fully 70% or more of the immune system of the body, what fights when something comes in, sits literally in intimate contact with the intestine. And I mean intimate. In fact, what's called the Peyer's patches or Peyer's patches are areas filled chock-a-block with immune system cells, all the different parts of what we call our innate immune system, our adaptive immune system, and all of those cells are sitting waiting for action. if those macromolecules, those toxins get in, it stimulates the immune system. And the immune system, depending on how it's been stimulated, how much it's been stimulated, etc., then sets off an immune response. And the key to that is, well, you say, well, so what's wrong with that? That's what it's supposed to do. Well, it is supposed to do it, but it's supposed to do it in a very regulated fashion, which normally means that the threshold for it going into action normally needs to be very high. The body says, don't bother me unless things get really bad.
Yeah.
When things are getting really bad, it's because all those tight junctions opened, all this stuff is getting in, the body is now being flooded with information. That threshold has come down. In other words, the immune system is working overtime and at a time when it should normally not even been working.
Right.
And so it is setting out the big guns. The howitzers are shooting off their shells at a time when they should be quiet. So you have what's called immune dysregulation. The immune system is working, but not in this exquisitely regulated way.
Yeah.
And when it does that, it is sending signals to all parts of the body. You know, they say what's in Las Vegas doesn't stay in Las Vegas. In other words, whatever was in the gut doesn't stay in that area.
Yeah.
Those signals now get sent out to all the different body parts. And depending on your genetic makeup, depending on environmental triggers, depending on your microbiome and how dysbiotic it is, meaning what is the balance of good and bad bacteria, all of that together is going to determine which part of the body is going to be affected more or less.
Right.
Give you an example. Celiacs, which have a tremendous amount of receptors on the intestinal cells to zonulin, will create massive responses to alpha-gliadin, which is in wheat, which for most of us is something we don't really respond to in any massive way. The body may not like it, but it says it's okay. Not with celiacs. So about 3% of the population will have this kind of an autoimmune response. Then there are 10 times the amount of celiacs that have the same symptoms, but they're called non-celiac sensitivity reactions. So that brings you into 20 or 30% of the population. Then you have diabetes, type 1. We used to call it juvenile diabetes. It's now been pretty well established that diabetes type 1 is in fact an autoimmune disease that has its gestation in the reaction of the gut and its immune system, which, as it turns out, targets the pancreatic area, leading us to what we know as diabetes. And then the list is immense. Various types of frank problems within the gut, what we call IBD, or inflammatory bowel disease, we now know has a very, very significant component of autoimmunity. We're not quite sure what all the players are, but we do know that that is another one. Then you have many neurological problems, including, and I'm even going to mention autism as one of the things which is now understood to have as a major vector, something which is impacting the body, leading to autistic or autistic-like responses of the body that have a strong gut component. And this list is getting bigger and bigger by the day.
Wow. Wow. And so I want to talk about getting into the, it's probably not a breakthrough now because I was digging back years on the research and watching videos that you did, you know, up to 6 years ago. And at that point, it was a new breakthrough with the re-establishment or modulation of autoimmune because of now we're fixing that issue of those tight junctions being able to function properly again. Let's talk about that.
Well, think about it. If one understands what I just mentioned,
Yeah.
if you can decrease the amount of triggers that are getting into the body, if you can decrease the vector of stuff getting through the intestinal wall and doing its dirty work, well, it doesn't take much of a leap to say, well, wait a minute, if we can control the permeability and keep everything in Las Vegas, then isn't there, theoretically, shouldn't there now be an amelioration of what's going on downstream because you've cut off the stuff that is causing it in the first place? And the answer to that is yes. That's precisely what we can do. So if you are decreasing intestinal permeability, you not only are able to control what's going on within the intestine, but of course downstream, now you are cooling down the immune response. It says, thank you very much. My threshold is going up again. I am not shooting off at anything now because much less is coming in to stimulate me. And that will lead to an amelioration of any number of inflammatory problems, which of course is the underpinning of a lot of this inflammation, especially chronic or hyperinflammation. By the way, inflammation is not a dirty word. Inflammation is what we need to heal. Without inflammation, we can't exist. It's when inflammation gets out of control, chronic, it just doesn't stop. Because you want inflammation to be an acute response to injury. You begin the healing process, and then the army says, you don't need me anymore, thank you, and they leave. If that army is continuing to fight constantly, then you get inflammatory reaction, which, if it continues, leads to what we then call an autoimmune reaction, because that is just constant inflammation. Let me just bring you right up to date. COVID-19 is the body's inflammatory response to a virus. And for some unfortunate people, the inflammatory response becomes a storm. It's called the cytokine storm. Everybody who's been reading the literature in the last year have become experts. And what does a cytokine storm mean? The immune system is sending out signals with all these cells, sending out signals to all the other cells saying, you gotta go and fight this thing. And it just inflames its way into death, because the body just over reacts with inflammation, especially in the lung. Not only the lung, but especially the lung. And so why are these people suffering all these problems? Because there's so much inflammation in the lung that the oxygen says, I can't get through it. It's filled with mucus and liquid because of the body's inflammatory response. So that COVID-19 is inflammation run amok. And that's why using corticosteroids like dexamethasone and all the things you heard about is, of course, a way of decreasing inflammation, because corticosteroids are anti-inflammatories. Bingo! That's the way you try to stop inflammation.
Amazing, amazing. That, I'm glad you shared that, because that's critical information. And I think a lot of people are misunderstanding kind of how that is all reacting, but that is a very clear and precise explanation of exactly what's happening in the body when that virus becomes.
So what are you going to ask me about our tests? What are you going to ask me about
right now? So let's talk about the test. So I told you I've got all these on hand, and so let's talk about practitioners. Let's talk about the testing. I want to talk about the intestine. We did touch on the intestinal IQ just a bit, but the metabolic IQ is new. So let's talk about what they can show us, what they can identify, and let's start there.
Let's make a couple of things very clear. Again, these are not diagnostic tests. I keep repeating that because you get people saying, well, I can't test because it's diagnostic. No, it's not.
No, they're wellness tests.
But we deal directly with healthcare professionals. Mm-hmm. So our customers are the healthcare professionals in the wellness space. Mm-hmm. They can be physicians, naturopaths, nutritionists, chiropractors, nurses, etc. They are the treating professionals. And of course, they're dealing with their clients, patients, etc. Excuse me. And so we say, what can we do as a lab to help you, the healthcare professional, get a better portrait of what is going on within this person?
Yeah.
And what is the roadmap that we can give you to better understanding it? That's what lab results do. They are an aid, a help in giving the healthcare professional with their expertise, looking at the person in front of them and saying, as one of my good friends said, don't guess, test, right? You don't throw it against the wall and see what sticks.
Exactly.
You say, let me see if I've got some things that can give me a better understanding. Yeah. So we got 3 things we do, as I mentioned in the beginning. We started with saliva. Mm-hmm. And what do we test? Hormones. What is the first thing we tell people to do? Do an adrenal check. Yeah. Check the adrenals. Why the adrenals, you may ask? Well, the adrenals produces cortisol and DHEAS. They are what everybody needs to know. Because if your cortisol levels are off, if you're under chronic stress, if you cannot function, then I don't care what you're going to do about food and food sensitivities. You're not getting better.
Yeah.
Because you haven't looked at the underlying problem. And you said it, Lisa, that is the key. There is a problem going on under this. Really, the adrenals are incredibly important. So what do we tell people? Order an adrenal test. Find out your diurnal cortisol rhythm and DHEA, which is important for many of the sex hormones and so on. And I won't get into how they affect the intestine. They do. But cortisol definitely does.
Yeah.
And chronic stress as an overall problem is critical. And you need to get a handle on that. You need to understand it.
Yeah.
And the way you understand it is do the test. Mm-hmm. And the test is going to show you if this person is flatlining, meaning their cortisol levels are down in the dumps from the morning on when they should be high, you've got a problem.
Yeah.
And you've got to deal with this person's underlying issue of chronic stress. So that's what you should do. That's number 1. The second thing that you need, and these are called the 5-star tests, the primary screening tests. There are dozens and dozens of other tests that you can do, of course, right? And physicians spend their whole day doing tests.
Yeah.
You know, when I did my medical rounds, I remember our teacher was telling us, he says, you know, I'm a good diagnostician. I know within the first 5 minutes what this person has, or at least I think I know from my experience. But it was the second sentence that was the key. He says, you know what I do after that? I test.
Yeah.
Well, you would say, well, wait a second. You just told me that you know what this person has. And the answer to that is, really? When did I start playing God? The fact is, I need to confirm. If I think I know, I need objective confirmation. And it could be diagnostic test, non-diagnostic. But he says, I need to know. So he puts a battery of tests through. Now he looks at them, and you've all seen the doctors looking at they spend all day looking at the tests to see where are they. Why? Because that tells them pretty well, confirms what many of them know, but now they say, aha, I actually know for sure. So much so that if they aren't testing, you know, they lose their license. Because someone's going to say, the college will say, you did what? you were treating them with, I don't know, diabetes without doing the basic series? What do you think you're doing? So in the wellness space, we're not saying you lose a license because you didn't, but the reason for testing in the year 2021 is just as important.
Yeah.
Doctors will treat disease. They will be able to say, I have conquered this disease. But the patient or the client says, thank you, but I still don't feel well. I don't feel optimal.
Yeah.
So what most non-physicians are doing is taking you from non-active disease to optimal. They're bringing you to the next step. So one of the ways of knowing is, are you under stress? So you do the saliva test. When it comes to the gut, very simple. First thing you want to know, foundational test, zonulin.
Yeah.
Right? You got to know if there's permeability.
Mm-hmm.
You want to do food sensitivity? Do food sensitivities. We have a 24 and an 88 food. It's an ELISA test, very sensitive, and it gives you the information you need. Remember, enzymes, imbalance, and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But I would say to people, why did you do a food sensitivity test without doing a zonulin test? I mean, what's it giving you? Well, yeah, okay, you'll get an idea of some of the foods. You'll get an idea of the imbalance. Yeah, I get it. I'm not against it. But you missed a very important part here. You missed what is it doing to the immune balance? What is it doing to the rest of the body? So, zonulin. And now I'm going to throw in something else, which we offer, and that is histamine and diamine oxidase, which we developed. They're all blood spot, remember? Dried blood spot. Yes. Why are we doing that? Because the immune system cells, they send out one of those signals. And one of the signals is histamine. Yeah. And histamine, we all know, right? Your eyes water when you eat certain things and so on. But there are a lot of histamine receptors in the gut. And if you've got very high histamine, you'd be in big trouble if it wasn't for the fact that there is something called diamine oxidase, which is an enzyme produced in intestinal cells, in the lumen, in the tube, that are produced to neutralize histamine. So the body says, yeah, you know what? You got histamine coming in, rich in histamine, bacteria create histamine. Don't worry about it. I've got enough DAO, that's diamine oxidase, to break it down. But what if there isn't? What if the body isn't producing enough DAO? Now you got yourself a problem. Yeah. Because now you're going to suffer all the consequences of histamine inflammation, because histamine is a major pro-inflammatory cytokine. It produces inflammation. One of the other interesting things we found out about diamine oxidase, however, is that it is produced in these intestinal cells. It's actually produced in the crypts, in the valleys of these little villi, these projections coming out of the cells. And when someone has bowel disease, inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, many other things, or a disproportionately high amount of pathogenic bacteria, what they do is eventually they break down the ability of these intestinal cells to produce DAO. And so it breaks down the integrity of the architecture of the cells. So guess what, folks? DAO is not only a way of testing if histamine is being properly broken down, but it's another biomarker of intestinal permeability. In fact, it is a biomarker of mucosal barrier integrity. So we got zonulin, we got DAO and histamine, we've got food sensitivity tests, and we've added to that the test for Candida. Remember I told you about the immunoglobulins Ga and M? Well, we test for the 3 immunoglobulins for Candida. What's Candida, you may ask? Well, Candida is a yeast, a fungus, that sits in our body. It can be there in very large quantities, and it represents about 80 or 85% of the fungi that live in the 15 trillion cell bacteria in the gut.
Yeah.
And if you've got dysbiosis, if you've got pathogens taking over, then Candida is right there. It's a poster child for what happens. So you want to know, is Candida increasing? So you can check off Candida as well. And that's a way of giving you a wonderful portrait of what is going on within the gut. Is it diagnostic? No, not meant to be. Is it a screening test? Yep. Is it a good way of getting a portrait? Are you in the right ballpark? Are you moving along the right road? You bet. And that's a way of letting you and your client or patient know, Mrs. Gefaffelgetter, here, look at what's on the paper. Here is what I think we can do to begin to solve your problem. So then what is our third group of tests? Well, we had a lot of your colleagues say to us, you've got to give us a test which we've known about, or tests that we've known about for a while, that would really help us in understanding globally what is going on with the metabolism in the body. Mm-hmm. And so we have redeveloped tests that have been around for a long time, but we're doing it with dried urine, and we call it our metabolic IQ. More to the point, we call it our metabolic wellness profile. It's 3 tests, and they're key. All of these, by the way, are well-known biomarkers. We are not rediscovering the wheel, but we're doing it in a very new way with dried urine, and we do it quantitatively. You actually get a number. You actually understand the number. So the first test we do is for digestion, and we test for indican. And indican has been around for decades. And Lisa, you and many of the practitioners know that indican is really a way of looking in the urine and seeing whether or not in the intestine there has been an increase in gram-negative bacteria, pathogens that are breaking down proteins in a non-complete fashion. When they do that, they create what's called putrefaction, which is just a terrible, icky word that says the protein's not being broken down properly. And it ends up forming through various steps in the liver and so on. It ends up turning indole into indican, which we've tested forever, but we've tested it as a qualitative way. Used to put little sticks in your office in a liquid and see the color changes. Well, we've gone one better. We're doing it quantitatively, and it's done with dried urine. Nice. Then there are a lot of people who say, well, okay, I know about that, but what's key to proper digestion and vice versa is liver function. Yes, and how 100%. Do you know if the liver is functioning properly? That's not a small point, right? Yeah. We call it detoxification. People say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means, is the liver breaking down stuff getting into it? That's what's called stage 1. So that is what we call detoxifying toxins that come from outside the body, from inside the body, doesn't matter. So you want to know, is the liver properly functioning? If the liver is not functioning properly, then the classic 12 bile acids, also known as total bile acids, will increase. Right. That's classic. The liver stops functioning properly, that increases, except in small groups of people where it will go down very low. I'm not going to get into that. But that is another way of very quickly being able to know, is the liver functioning properly? And the third test, which actually in many ways is the most important one, is that we are giving for the first time a test in dried urine for 8-OHDG. 8-OHDG is 8-hydroxyl-2-deoxyguanosine. You say, what is that? Well, that is oxidation of DNA in the nucleus of the cell and in the mitochondrion of the cell. And when that gets oxidized for reasons we're not going to get into right now, that is classic oxidative stress, meaning the body has cells within it which are filling up with what's called free radicals. These are things you don't want because they adulterate the cell. They break down the membrane. They break down the ability of proteins to be properly dealt with by the cell, and it breaks down the proper functioning of DNA. That triad of DNA, lipid, and protein dysfunction makes the cell so dysfunctional that it cannot properly do what it needs to do, and eventually it will either mutate or it'll die. It goes to what's called apoptosis. You don't want that. You want to keep oxidative stress at bay. You want to keep it low level. And I'm sure everybody today reads about detoxing and all kinds of oxidative deoxidative systems and antioxidants and so on. They're real. That's what you need to be able to neutralize the oxidative damage that is taking place in the cell. So we have a test. Again, it's part of that one series of 3 tests on one paper, and we show you greens and yellows and reds, and we show you where you are in that area, so that you now can say to this person, I've done the saliva test, so I know where your hormones are, adrenals. I've done the intestinal testing, so we know what the permeability issues are, etc. And last but not least, with our dried urine test, all of these done in the comfort of the person's home, we are getting a good portrait of metabolics, which ultimately is saying, how well is the body functioning?
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's what it's saying, right? Because if it doesn't function properly, everything else falls apart. And so with very straightforward tests, you get an incredible amount of information, which can then lead you to not only better treatment, but if that person needs secondary testing, and let me be very clear, if this person is in trouble and needs treatment by licensed professionals, physicians, etc., so be it. Of course, there's no question that people who have these issues need to be sent to the appropriate people to treat them. That has never been in question. But not everybody has to be there. Remember, you want to get them to optimal. Many of them are already treated and they don't have active disease, but they're sitting somewhere above that and they're saying, I don't feel well.
Yeah.
And the job of many people in the wellness space is to get them from no active disease or obvious active disease to I feel fine. And that is quite a trick.
Yes. And I always love when somebody says, I feel like myself again. That's all, right? That is just, that's why a lot of us do what we do, because, that's what we want. We want them to feel like themselves. And so I do want to touch on, just before we sign off here, because I do believe, so let's say somebody's not working with a health practitioner at this point, but they want to do the testing. Do the general public have the ability to order testing and then maybe a recommended practitioner from Fluids IQ, or they need to find a practitioner that has the testing?
Yeah. We deal then with, as I said earlier, that whole group, and it's quite a long list, up and down, from physicians, naturopaths, RNs, chiropractors, various types of a myriad of different health professionals, which the client, the patient, needs to get to in their jurisdiction, wherever that is. And then to say to that person, I listened to a lecture in which there's this lab, Fluids IQ, and I really would very much like you to look into partnering with them, becoming a registered clinician with the lab, so that the patient or client, can get advantage of these tests. That's what your general public needs to do. It's extremely important. Your job is to go out there and tell the clinicians that haven't heard about us, which is perfectly normal, you know, they have to hear about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when a clinician is ready, they register with us. Very simple, as you know, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
And then we send them kits, or we drop ship kits. Or if you are now registered with us, your patient or client can go onto our website, can order the kit, but you need to give them a code.
That was my
code
question.
says,
okay. Yeah.
I'm allowing you to use my code because the test result will come to me, the healthcare professional.
Makes sense.
And I will then deal with you.
Yes.
But they cannot do it without the code.
Well, that was a myriad of amazing information. So much education today with regards to wellness, with regards to some wellness testing that I think personally is vital to know, what your clients are dealing with or what you're dealing with as a client of a practitioner or a physician. And so, Dr. Gonshor, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. And for everybody watching on YouTube, make sure you give this podcast a like, subscribe to my channel. We have a brand new episode every 2 weeks, and we're on all of your favorite podcast hosts. So make sure you give us a comment and give us a like. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to today's show. Head over to lisapitel-killah.com to gain access to some amazing free resources that will help you gain energy, erase debilitating symptoms, and be the best version of you. Remember to give this podcast a like and follow me on social media at Lisa Pitel-Killah. I'm here every 2 weeks with a brand new episode of the Human Optimization Podcast. Until next time.